The crystal above the head table trembled as a champagne flute hit the marble and shattered, tiny stars scattering across gleaming plates. For a second, the room fell into a brittle silence. Then a dozen conversations rushed back like a tide, louder for the interruption. At the center of the noise, someone whispered, and that whisper traveled like wildfire. He refuses every eligible woman, except the married one. Dominic Goo sat like a still black statue at the table's head, one hand wrapped around a glass he wasn't drinking from. In a room full of polished smiles and silk, he was abrupt angles and quiet heat. Reporters had long called him Vidian City's golden bachelor. Ladies sent invites and bouquets. Marriages had been brokered to him before he ever gave a single answer. Tonight, as the Liu and Goo families met for the annual alliance banquet, all of that expectation felt like a second garment on Dominic, fitted, expensive, but alien to his skin. Across the table, Saraphina Jang laughed too loudly. Her laugh was an act of defiance, sharp, controlled, because she was the scandal everyone wanted to stare at. The embroidery of her dress caught the light and threw it back like a small rebellion. Her husband, Arthur Liu, sat nearest her, color drained from his face that would have been stubborn vanity in another life. He kept reaching for the napkin only to stop, like someone who had been taught to charge but had forgotten the choreography. "Mrs. Liu," Mrs. Goo said with the kind of smile that carved out territory, "you look theatrical this evening. How fortunate for us." Seraphina's eyes flicked to Mrs. Goo, cold, amused. "We aim to entertain, Madame Goo. Vidian can't live on caviar and compliments alone." A ripple of guarded laughter. Mrs. Goo's fingers tightened on her silverware. "The city eats spectacle for breakfast." Her gaze slid to Dominic with a question in it. Why him? Why now? Dominic's reply was a small, almost imperceptible tilt of the chin toward Saraphina. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Wherever he looked, the room rearranged itself. Someone at the other end of the table, an anxious cousin of Arthur's who'd hoped to curry both family favor and a photo op, leaned forward with the cheap cruelty of the board. "Mrs. Liu," he said loud enough for cameras to catch, "tell us, do you enjoy stealing other men's attention? There are rumors, photos, videos." The cameras shifted like predatory birds. Someone in a dark suit produced a phone and brightened the scene. A looped clip that didn't show much, but that was the point. Blur, a hand on a coat, a laugh, Dominic's hand at his side. The insinuation needed only the weight of the city behind it to rip open. Murmurs swelled into accusation, polite spouses turned into predators. Saraphina leaned forward, porcelain jaw firm. "Make your point then, cousin. Spare us the theatrics if your aim is gossip." Arthur's hands trembled upon the table. The Liu family elders stiffened like statues in a chapel. Liu Sr.'s face was a map of disapproval carved by generations. His mouth a tight line, his eyes cold as flint. He'd built an empire on blindsides and proper marriages. A scandal would be a crack in the tiled floor he'd walked over every morning. Dominic's voice cut the room, low, controlled. "Rumors don't become facts because they have a soundtrack." It was not an answer, it was a divider. Flashbulbs blinked. Journalists scribbled. Mrs. Goo raised a thin hand like a judge calling for order. "Dominic, surely you understand the optics. My son is courting alliances." "Your son?" Dominic's cutting humor landed like a knife. "You mean offers. There are always offers. What we have is different." Mrs. Goo's smile froze. She was used to men being deferential to her statements. This was not deference. It was an erasure. For a few taut seconds, she stared at Dominic like a woman who had misread the weather. Saraphina watched it all like someone at a duel, calm, detached. But behind her eyes, something feral flared. She pulled the napkin to her lap and met Dominic's gaze openly. If your definition of different includes the freedom to stand here and humiliate my husband for dinner conversation, consider rewriting your definitions, she said. Or else tell the reporters to write their own tragedies. A few guests laughed, a brittle sound that did not reach Dominic's table. Arthur's face went white. His voice, when it came, was the sound of a man collapsing into old habits. Enough, Saraphina, stop! Stop, she snapped her head to him. Stop what? Being embarrassed? Being married to a man who thinks a lawyer can glue his dignity back on? Arthur, do you want me to? Not here, he hissed. Not now. No, now, she returned with cold precision. Because here is where I decide whether or not your shame will be my cross. The banquet held its breath. For a city that loved spectacle, the exchange was practically a religion. Cameras trained, lenses clicked. At the far wall, someone in a glossy black blazer whispered into a phone, "Run the loop at 11. Add the frame of Dominic standing with her yesterday. Get quotes." Dominic slid a finger under the rim of his glass and broke the stem. He let the shard fall into his palm and watched the red wine collect like a tiny island. It was absurd, the gesture of a man who had everything and wanted to break something simple. He rose, not to attack, but to place himself between Saraphina and the rest of the room. "No accusations tonight," he said. His voice carried without raising it, and the room shrunk around the sound. "If anyone has a problem with any part of this evening, they can bring it to me privately. I prefer we keep the tabloids for gossip and not for personal vendettas." Mrs. Goo's smile thinned and slid into a pliable mask. "Dominic." "Tonight," he said, "we will not auction dignity." It was not a defense of Saraphina, so much as a proclamation of authority. Later, the papers would argue whether he had defended her to protect a debt or a desire, to shield a weakness or a debt of honor. Tonight, no one could be sure. The cameras focused on his jaw, on the steady gaze he offered, and on how near he was to Saraphina, as if proximity alone conferred ownership. After the main course, in a garden courtyard where orange lanterns threw lazy light over clipped hedges, Saraphina slipped away from the crowd. She had the practiced grace of a woman who had learned to command attention and then peel away from it like a scratch from silk. Dominic followed a few steps behind, measured and quiet. "You could have left it to them," she said. "Let the city have its fun." Dominic's shoes edged into the lantern light. "I don't enjoy public theater," he said, "but I don't like to watch someone I care about be used as a punchline." She stopped and turned. For a second, her defensiveness melted, and something knifed through her expression. Surprise, then curiosity, then the practiced mask of indifference. "Care about," she repeated slowly, as if tasting a foreign language. "That's the phrase the tabloids will take and hang on the wall." Let them. He looked at her as if he had been waiting to study her face. Whatever they want to write, it won't change what happened tonight. "That's very noble of you, Dominic, to defend the person your city thinks you can't touch." Her smile held too many edges. "Or is it more than nobility? Maybe a private amusement?" He bristled, then softened. "What we are to each other doesn't need your hypotheses." She laughed. "Humor me. Why do you, of all people, step up like that? You're a man who could buy entire opinion columns." He paused. The night air smelt faintly of orange zest and cigarette smoke that had blown over from an ashtray inside. For the first time, he looked younger than his title allowed. "Because once," he said, and that one word made the world narrow. Her brows lifted. "You keep that close to your chest." "It's not a shield," he said. "It's an anchor." They stood there, two people circled by gossip and manicured hedges, with a whole city between them. Saraphina's lips quirked into something tender. "Anchor," she repeated, then turned away, as though the word weighed more than she wanted to carry. "You thank me for that. I should remind you I don't do things for free, Dominic. If you think that makes you my debtor, be careful." He let the threat be hers, and didn't protest. He was not interested in ownership by ledger. He was interested in something that had nothing to do with money, the memory that pulsed behind his ribs, a debt older than the awards on his walls. A laugh came from the courtyard's arched doorway. Saraphina Jang, a woman with the kind of smooth beauty built by careful marriages, held a glass like a weapon. She stepped into the lantern light with the poise of a woman who had never been denied anything she wanted. "How touching," she said. "Two people standing by the shrubbery exchanging secrets." "Saraphina," Dominic said. There was no greeting, only the brief, cool acknowledgement a man affords potential alliances. Saraphina made a little show of fanning her lashes. "I thought we'd talk about tomorrow, charity gala. It's almost time for formal engagements. The city loves a firm handshake." Her smile slid to Saraphina. "Arthur, darling, I trust you'll be able to control your wife by then?" Arthur's laugh came out as a bark that had lost its confidence. "Arthur can manage what he wants," she said, and the words were sharp as a tongue of steel. The exchange was polite warfare. Dominic watched it all, seeing the chess pieces arranged by older hands. Mrs. Goo's ambitions, Lou Sr.'s pride, Serena's ladder climb. He understood how alliances could be hammered into a life like a nail. He knew how quickly a woman like Saraphina could be pitted as prize, scandalized into disgrace to serve a boardroom compromise. "Don't forget to invite the press," Mrs. Goo called from behind, voice lacquered with poison. "We must let everyone know how respectable families navigate scandal." For a second, the night looked like a table waiting for knives. If this is pulling you in, subscribe to follow the next chapter of their story. The next morning, the city woke to a new kind of headline. Divorce rumor, mistress, billionaire's obsession. Images of the previous night's banquet were pinned and dissected. A snippet of a longer video, an angle where Dominic reached to steady Saraphina as she laughed, became a magnet for speculation. Commentators argued about body language as if it were sacred text. Saraphina's name trended. Dominic's public relations team issued a statement about respecting family privacy, and a dozen pundits wrote editorials about power, propriety, and the audacity of a single man to entangle himself with an already married woman. By noon, a car skidded on the slick ribbon of an overpass, metal screaming. Paperwork would later show it was a two-car collision with no fatalities, an angry, anxious tangle of brakes and metal. But the footage the street cameras captured had already begun to feed the rumor mill. In one clip, a car wheel spun in the rain like a bad omen. In another, a figure staggered away and helped a man to the curb. For the vultures on social media, that figure was Saraphina. For the outraged, it was proof of deceit. For some, it was a staged tableau meant to manipulate sympathy. Arthur was the man who ended up at the hospital in a neck brace and a hurt that made him bluster into silence. Lou Sr. arrived like a storm cloud. Edward Jang, Saraphina's father, stormed in with the voice of small-town bravado elevated to city volume. He looked less like a protector and more like a man trying to inflate his pride over an embering scandal. "Is he hurt?" Saraphina asked, and her voice was thinner than the silk she favored. Arthur's eyes flicked to her, hurt and a flash of the man he could be if he stopped caring about appearances. "I've got a sprain. It's nothing." A doctor in a blue mask said more comforting things than the rawness of reality warranted. Dominic arrived without fanfare, a pair of dark sunglasses jamming arrogance and protection into one silhouette. He ignored cameras. He ignored nurses trying to angle a statement. He went straight to Arthur's side, checked the brace, and then knelt in a way that surprised everyone. For his part, Arthur flinched, not from the physical touch, but from the intimate possibility that a stranger knew more about him than his wife did. Mrs. Goo took command of a corner like a general arranging her regiments. "Damage control," she issued, voice cool. "The Loos will issue a release. We will remind everyone of propriety." "But there's a video," someone whispered. "Then we find its source," Mrs. Goo said. "We make the source look credible." Dominic's assistant said something to him in a low tone. Legal counsel, speaking about reflection periods, confidentiality, a blank page of signed papers that could be pushed into motion. The reflection period, the invisible fang of family law, would keep Arthur legally married until certain conditions passed. It was a legal cooling-off time that would make a divorce messy if the family chose that route. Lou Sr., eyes hardened, began to make the calls that could rearrange futures faster than a heartbeat. Outside the emergency room windows, a line of reporters created a living barrier. One of them waved his phone like a talisman. "Mrs. Lou," he shouted, "do you deny the affair? What does Mr. Goo say?" Saraphina stepped outside to breathe. Rain had started, fat and cold, and it spattered her cheeks into something that might have been tears, if anyone wanted to believe it. Dominic followed and stood near, the city noise a dull roar behind them. "You don't have to be here," she said, without turning, but there was no bile in it, only the fact of observation. He was the kind of man that didn't leave people he cared for in public fires. "I'm already in it," he said. "You saved me once. That doesn't expire." "Saved you," she echoed. She stood very still as if balancing something delicate. "People love to frame me as the woman who walks in at just the right moment. It fits a romantic headline. It fits an accusation, too. People also forget that some debts aren't monetary." He was careful with what he said, because words in a hospital could be misread as vows or threats. He reached out and took her wrist to check for a pulse as much as to steady her in the rain. There was an intimacy in that touch that wasn't for public consumption. Saraphina allowed it. Her jaw softened like the closing of a box. Inside, Lou Sr. moved pieces on a board brewed from shame and money. "If this continues," he snarled into a phone, "there will be a reckoning. I will not have my grandson's name dragged through filth." "Divorce is an option," a cousin offered, too eager. "We have lawyers, signed precedents." Lou Sr.'s response was sharp as a coin. "A divorce would poison both houses. We will not make it public unless there's no other path." The family's calculus was brutal and quick. For them, marriage was a ledger to be balanced with reputation and profit. For Saraphina, it was a cage with doors that opened into public humiliation. For Dominic, it was a challenge that pressured an old wound. Hours later, in a hospital corridor smelling of antiseptic and lemon, Dominic sat with a folded legal pad of papers on his lap. Pages on a divorce schedule, reflection periods explained in legalese, a clause that required mediation, a clause that could stifle momentum. He turned the paper, not because he needed to know the law, he had teams for that, but because it made him feel like something could be done by the arrangement of ink. Edward Jang arrived, breathless and loud. "My daughter is," he began. "A homewrecker," Saraphina finished for him. She stood with the weary boldness of someone always expected to defend her name. "I am her own woman." Edward bristled, pride softened only slightly with fear. "Do not call your own fountain of rumors, Mrs. Lou." Saraphina's laugh was a single, cold note. "Father, drop the theatrics. The city will take whatever shape you give it." Edward wanted to strike back, to puff himself into a protector. Instead, he asked questions into the air like arrows. Legal strategy, damage control, where Dominic stood. Dominic answered in halting sentences that had the weight only truth can give. "I will not hand her to gossip," he said. "If that is what you fear, do not expect me to hand over what I will not. If you expect me to bargain for respectability at her expense, you will be disappointed." Lou Sr., who had stood in the corner like a judge mournful of his own options, listened. For a man who valued reputation above all, Dominic's statement was a rupturing force. The room shifted. Lou Sr. had enemies whose power rivaled his. Dominic had money and a certain infuriating autonomy. "We can negotiate," Mrs. Goo murmured later to Lou Sr., out of Dominic's earshot. "There has to be a price. We can make him—" The sentence ended with a look that meant yield. Lou Sr. considered. "Not yet," he said. "We wait. Let the city eat its fill. We study the market for scandal." That night, the tabloids found a new feast. An anonymous clip of Saraphina at the wheel, apparently startled moments before the crash. The clip's provenance was murky, and the angle guilty of selective editing. But images, once released, are hard to kill. For every principal journalist, there were 5 with cameras fixed on the chase of the moment. Dominic watched the clips, his face a mask of distant anger. He was not a man of gratuitous displays, but he understood leverage. He could call his people, and he could call in favors. He could turn the city's noise into a hush. He could also be brutal in ways Bartleby at the tabloids could not predict. For all he had, title, company, habit, he carried an obligation the city didn't see. A young man once collapsed in a rain-soaked alley, and Saraphina had been the only hand that reached for him. The details were private and brittle and kept in Dominic's chest like a fossil. At the hospital, in a private room too bright with fluorescent honesty, Saraphina sat and held a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Dominic did the practical things. He smoothed a blanket over an old scar on her wrist, something he had noticed the night they'd first met, and he asked questions that were more about listening than asking. "Why did you save me?" he asked, blunt and sudden. She blinked, and then, with a softness he rarely saw, told the story. Not all at once, but in pieces. A crowded train station, a misunderstanding, a man who had been shoved into the path of a delivery bike. She had pulled him out with a hand on the collar. She had been breathing hard and angry, and afterward had vanished into the crowd. He had only the memory of a hand and a name. When he had looked her up years later, because he is a man who investigates, the death's outline had been a quiet thing he couldn't explain. "It was nothing," she said. "You were in trouble. I stepped in. People do that sometimes." "No," he corrected quietly. "You didn't do it because it was nothing. You did it because you decided someone else mattered in that second. That matters." She looked away and then back, eyes bright. "You make my small act sound epic." "It saved me," he said. "That's enough to explain a great deal." She squeezed the warm cup, and the tremor in her hold spoke of smaller fears. Around them, the city hummed a drone of speculation. Inside, 2 people traded the kind of truth that had nothing to do with headlines, favors and returns, debts, and the strange economy of gratitude. He paid in ways he didn't fully understand. She accepted because, sometimes, a person accepts being part of a story if it fits their needs. Before Dominic left the room, he reached into his pocket for his phone. There was a small contact list labeled Blacklist and Unblock, a private cruelty he inflicted on chaos. An old tic for someone who managed lines of access like people managed portfolios. He didn't unblock her on his phone. He didn't need to. Some choices were larger than a list. Outside the hospital, Mrs. Goo chaired a war room in her penthouse. Display screens, PR specialists, and the sort of calm panic only the very rich know. "We will not allow our family to be compromised," she said, and each word was a spear. "If Mr. Goo insists on playing cavalier, then we will use the law. We will petition Lou Sr. to force the Lous into quiet resolution. If they fail, then—" "Then what?" a strategist ventured. "Then we publish," she replied. "We leak. We call in favors. We make sure the public chooses its side against her." There, in the gilded chaos, alliances were being formed and unmade. The city's gossip would be fed by gloved hands that smiled. Dominic's choice would be the fulcrum on which social media and boardroom strikes swung. When Dominic returned to his high-rise, late, the city a spill of lights below, he found that leaving the hospital had not eased the pressure. He wandered through his office like a man trying to find a map amongst ashes. He called a lawyer who spoke in calm, legal syllables about reflection periods and non-disparagement clauses. Contracts slid under the door like small, dangerous offerings. "She is married," the lawyer reminded him. "The law is not a charity. Be careful." Dominic didn't dispute it. He merely set the papers aside and picked up an old photograph from his desk drawer. A younger version of himself, hair unkempt, hands scraped, and beside him a woman with her hair windblown, eyes fierce. The photograph was a relic of the night he had been saved. He had kept it because when gratitude lived in the world, it shaped decisions like weather shapes trees. He could make calls and he could make threats of reputation. He could also choose not to. In a city built on transactions, his decision to stand by a married woman would be read as a transaction and a promise, both of which could be weaponized. Mrs. Goo would see it as a failure of stewardship. Lou Sr. would see it as an opening and a threat. He sat at his window and watched the endless glass of the opposite skyline reflect back at him. His phone buzzed. A message from his mother, clipped and immaculate. "Think carefully," or "Think as I expect." He put his phone face down. For the first time in years, his family wasn't plotting his next alliance. They were plotting to remove what they saw as a contaminant. He thought about Saraphina's laugh the night before, about her hand in the rain, about the way she had pulled him up out of the city noise and left. He thought about the way the tabloids would write his motives, and how his mother would read them as treachery. He made a decision that would send ripples into the boardrooms, into the Lou's drawing rooms, into the chatter that made marriages and broke them. He would not hand Saraphina over to the city. It was not a rescue. It was a choice. He didn't know yet what that choice would cost him, but choices always demanded a price. The first sign of consequence came the next morning in the precise shape of a misdemeanor threat. Someone had left a rat's nest of anonymous comments under Saraphina's charity page, accusing her of buying pity for press. Her businesses, modest and private, received strange visitors. A man representing a compliance firm asked questions about receipts and donations. His interest a veiled threat. Arthur was summoned to a meeting by Lou Sr.'s counsel. Mrs. Goo watched Dominic's every move like a hawk circling its own kin. In the afternoon, a video surfaced on the feed. Saraphina laughing with Dominic at a private charity dinner 3 months earlier. 2 bodies too close for the city's comfort. It wasn't new footage, but with a clever edit and malicious voiceover, it began to look like a pattern. The narrative formed itself out of stitches and rumor. Saraphina, alone in her flat at night, opened a drawer and took out a pair of cheap bandages. Her hands moved with the practiced care of someone who had packed a small medical kit into every bag for years. Bandages, a small antiseptic, a strip of gauze. She wrapped an old wound on her arm where a story had left a mark. She was quietly practical in danger. She was always the person who reached for the thing that made pain smaller. She thought of Dominic as she pressed the bandage down, and the thought came with no promise, no plan, just the slow recognition that someone who had once been saved had opened a chapter he did not intend to close. Outside, the city got louder. Headlines multiplied like mold on bread. The Loos and the Goos arranged themselves for war. The tabloids sharpened. And Dominic, the man with everything to lose, found that the one person he wanted to protect was the one the city most wanted to consume. A knock came at Saraphina's door later that night. When she opened it, 2 photographers' flashes went off hard enough to burn the corneas of memory. A camera lens intruded like an accusation. A man in a suit pushed a folded paper into her hands. A petition for divorce, an offer of a settlement, a clause that read "reflection period" in bold, clinical letters. It was a weapon in legal form. Sign and withdraw from the public eye, or face a drawn-out, headline-hungry dissolution. She looked up into the camera and for the first time since the banquet let something unmasked appear in her expression. A sliver of fear, a flash of anger, and, underneath both, the stubborn refusal of a woman who had never been fully owned. Dominic watched the video of that moment, zoomed in to the way she didn't sign. He felt a hot pressure gather in his chest, an old debt remade into a new contract that only he would see fit to honor. He could have ignored the bandage at his desk, the paper on his lap, the woman who refused to be bought. Instead, he made a call that set a new line between him and his family. "No," he said, "I will not play this game." Mrs. Goo heard his single word on speakerphone as if it were a hammer on glass. "You will—" "No," he said again, and the line clicked as though he'd nailed it shut. He picked up his car keys and walked out into a rain that smelled faintly of lemons and old promises toward a life that would not be shaped by cash or contracts alone. The city watched him go, like a tide watching a rock. For some, the decision was a scandal in embryo. For others, an advert for reckless romance. For Dominic, it was the steady repayment of something that had no currency. And above all, the loop of a photograph, his and hers, older and brighter, sat on his desk smiling back at him like a small, stubborn accusation. Once you were saved. What will you now become? Rain had a way of rewriting a city overnight. It smoothed the edges of neon and made the glass of high-rises look like oceans. Dominic drove through that softened landscape, with the engine whispering between his teeth. He had not felt like a man with plans, only like someone holding a thin, dangerous ledger of what had been given to him and what he could never repay. The photograph on his desk, the memory of a hand on his collar, and a name whispered into a crowded night. Those things had become a quiet reckoning he could not ignore. He arrived back at the hospital just as the sky unclenched itself. Reporters still waited, umbrellas closed like black question marks. He moved through them with a practiced indifference that did not fool anyone. Men of power rarely needed to shout to make an entrance. His presence rearranged the air in the corridor as surely as a lighthouse shifts the pattern of waves. Saraphina sat in a plastic chair, her coat damp at the collar. Where once she had been theatrical, her expression had narrowed into the spare, efficient look of someone who understood the mechanics of crisis. Dominic stayed near the doorway and watched before he approached. Sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was to arrive and then wait to be asked for help. "You don't have to be here," she said, and the words were softer than he expected. His reply was simple, "I am." She looked up at him then, long enough that the cameras beyond the glass might imagine intimacy where there was only 2 people measuring a risk. "You can walk away, Dominic. You can go back to arrangements and shareholders. You don't need to." "What I need is not the point," he interrupted. "The point is that I won't let them make you a target." She let the sentence sit. "People already think I'm a target. They think I fall into people's stories like I was designed for plot points." "Let them think," he said. "I won't let them act." She smiled then, a small, brittle thing. "You sound dangerously noble." He didn't refute it. There were things you could present as principles, and things you held because of a night that had nothing to do with principle, gratitude, recollection, a memory of breath that had kept him from curdling into something colder. Whatever the name for it, it shaped him now. The hospital staff made their perfunctory announcements and then closed the door on public facing. Inside the private room, behind curtains and the low, clinical hum of a fluorescent light, Dominic and Saraphina talked without the performative clarity of press statements. Saraphina spoke of the petition shoved at her by a suit with a camera lens waiting like a jury. She told him about the anonymous messages that had begun to smear the charities she ran quietly, donations questioned, volunteers sniped by rumor, a scheduled fundraiser at risk because someone had decided to mix gossip with ledger books. "You could hire them," she said. "Security, lawyers, I know you have." "It is not a question of whether I can," Dominic said, then pressed his thumb to the corner of a legal pad on his knee. "It's a question of whether you want what I can afford." Seraphina's laugh was sharp. "You always make money sound like a solvent." He watched her. She had, in the weeks after the banquet, become both a headline and a strategy across many rooms, an unwanted variable. Everywhere he looked, schematics of power were unfolding. Mrs. Goo in a war room with PR specialists, Lou Sr. convening strategists, Serena Chen arranging appearances under the pretense of charity. The city turned the two of them into a soundbite, and the soundbite kept being amplified until it was the only thing anyone heard. Dominic held the pad as if feeling for lines he could not yet read. "No bargaining," he said finally. "I'm not going to buy you off. I won't let them buy you either." There was a moment, thin and electric, where she considered the shape of his words. She had never wanted to be someone's purchase. If anything, her choices had always been a response to other people's currency, the town's gossip, her father's pride, the Lou's empire. She had learned how to pay back with mismatched coin, wit, posture, a refusal to apologize. "Then what do you want?" she asked. Dominic's answer was the kind of quiet thing that seemed loud because of its refusal to conform. Not to be a weapon. She blanked. "Not to be what?" "A weapon," he repeated. "I will not be used as a cudgel to beat you into a place that isn't yours." She almost smiled, but something in her jaw tightened. "You realize how that sounds to them? To my father? To Lou Sr.? "Let them say what they wish," he said. "Actions will matter more than statements." They left the hospital at different times. Dominic returned to his tower and found his mother waiting on the other end of the line with the kind of practiced ice that had melted very little over a long life. "Think carefully," Mrs. Goo said, and the admonition was a razor of impeached affection. "There are reputations stitched to your name. Contracts will follow. You think I ask for this to be easy? I am asking you as a mother." "It is not easy for me either," Dominic said. "You cannot live as a man who ignores the needs of his family," she said. "We will be harmed." "You will be harmed either way," he answered. "If going forward with this means we all sacrifice for a woman's reputation you pretend to save by money, then we are choosing a false economy. If I defend her, it must be because it is right, or because I choose to stand against the use of power to harm someone. My loyalty is not a currency to be exchanged for comfort." Mrs. Goo did not argue the moral terms. She argued the practical ones. "Then choose which alliances you will protect. That is the civil strategy. You do not need to announce anything. Quiet will win." Dominic thought of quiet. It had advantages. It also had a tendency to desert people who needed audible defense. "There is no quiet now," he said. "There is noise. We must address it." Mrs. Goo's breath made a sound that wasn't quite a chuckle. "You have always wanted to make a scene. Do not make me regret raising you with a taste for spectacle." He hung up without answering. He had friends, lawyers, PR specialists, men and women who could turn a story into ash. He also had limits. He would not, for instance, orchestrate a smear campaign against Arthur or Saraphina's family. He had lines. He had a stubborn, private understanding that gratitude didn't mean he could decide for someone else. If Saraphina chose to leave town or sign papers, it would have to be because she wished it, not because he had financed silence. That was a discipline of restraint that his mother could not understand. The next morning, the tabloids found fresh material. A factory worker who claimed her distant cousin had seen Dominic and Saraphina together in an alley months ago. A supposed insider who had been paid to say the couple had arranged a meeting. A local vlogger who stitched footage into a narrative and titled it "The Golden Bachelor and the Married Temptress." The city constructed a new mythology by repetition. For every voice that had close knowledge of the facts, there were 5 who improvised certainty. Arthur's world shrank to a series of rooms he was told to inhabit. Lou Sr. convened one of those meetings that felt like a small audit of a family's honor. There were lawyers, family elders, and a woman in pearl earrings who acted like a gatekeeper to the older man's patience. "You will sign," Lou Sr. said, as if he were discussing a ledger. "It will be cleaner." Arthur's fingers twitched. He was a man who had been comfortable wearing other people's expectations like tailored suits. In private, he felt threadbare. "If I sign," he stammered, "I lose." "You lose what you ought to have never used as currency," Lou Sr. interrupted. "You retain your dignity. We retain our name. This is a compromise." Arthur looked at Saraphina, who had arrived less theatrical and more resolved. "You will sign?" She met his eyes like she was measuring a cut. "I will not sign because you ask me to. If there is wrongdoing between us, we will be blunt. But I will not be bullied into a paperwork exit to keep families neat. I'm not yours to tidy." Arthur's mouth moved, and he looked like a man realizing he had been given a knife and told to carve out a life he had not designed. "You are making enemies," he said, in a voice that wanted to be paternal but sounded like fear. "Then make them," Saraphina said. "If being a woman with agency is an enemy, then plan your reprisals carefully." There was dangerous humor in how she spoke, like someone who had learned to throw a grenade as a distraction, then walk away with the debris. Lou Sr.'s eyes flicked to Dominic, and for the first time since the banquet, the old man's face betrayed a crack of unease. Dominic had not been invited to this meeting. He did not need a formal invitation to make his presence felt. He had already become the pivot around which this family's decisions would turn. Meanwhile, Serena Chen began to insert herself into the press circuit with a rehearsed cadence. She hosted a small luncheon for charity with cameras present, and made sure Dominic's name was mentioned often in offhand remarks. She wore the kind of smile that could be weaponized, warm enough to be photographed, distanced enough to be untouchable. "But of course, we must support Dominic in whatever he chooses," Serena said into the microphones, like a woman who had learned to sound generous while calculating debt. "If a gentleman of his standing chooses a path, we must admire his courage." Her words were a public chess move, flattering Dominic while reminding everyone he had a backing option, a respectable alliance, a visible engagement, the type of marriage Mrs. Goo would want. Dominic did not answer her invitations. He did not need to. His refusal would speak as loudly as any acceptance. Publicity had its own appetite. One afternoon, a video appeared on a gossip site. Someone had filmed the alley from months before with an angle that obscured most of the scene but highlighted 2 hands, a shove, a face scraping gravel. The comments exploded. For the internet, a damaged face always made the best story. For Dominic, the clip was a reopen of an old wound. He went to see the source. It was an old surveillance feed from a grocer's camera, grainy and unhelpful to anyone who wanted ironclad evidence. But in the feed, he watched the shape of the moment that had tied him to Saraphina. A delivery bike skittering, an accidental shove, a woman pulling a man away from a path. In the low resolution, his memory filled the blanks. The shape of breath, the shock of breath, the moment something that could have been a beginning of ending had been given another thread because of a single human action. That memory hardened into a resolve. If the world wanted to tell stories, he would not be the puppet smiling for the camera. He would be the one to control how the scene was read. Not from a place of revenge, but from a place of truth. He hired counsel, not to file petty countersuits, but to protect Saraphina from procedural harassment. He asked them to draw up non-disparagement demands that were legal tools rather than weapons, procedural shields that could keep certain outlets from printing lies that would materially harm her livelihood. He also directed his people to watch the social media streams, trace the clips back to sources, and build a case. He made it clear in no uncertain terms that his resources were at Saraphina's disposal and that he would not bankroll a campaign of retribution. This was the line he wanted to keep: protection without ownership. Saraphina listened and pushed back. "I don't want to be a project," she said once, when they met at a small cafe the lawyers had suggested for its privacy. Outside, the city buzzed. Inside, the air smelt faintly of citrus and milk foam. "I know," Dominic answered. "You are not a cause." "Nor am I a charity," she said. "I will not be a headline that you rescue." "Then what do you want me to do?" His voice wasn't insistent, it was searching. "Let me choose," she said. "Let me decide if I leave, if I stay, if I fight. Help me with the tools, not the script." He considered. He knew how easy it would be to take away her autonomy under the pretense of saving it. He could silence the critics, bribe the right hands, buy privacy. He also knew the cost of that privacy. If she accepted his shield, a part of her would be indebted in a way he respected but could not force her to accept. "Okay," he said, "I will give you the tools. I will not write the script." And so they arranged practicalities: counsel contacts, PR advisories, a secure line for her to reach him if the world turned sharp. He did not unblock her number on his private phone, not yet. The act would have felt ceremonious, too much like possession. He left the motif of the blacklist and the unblock as a private puzzle, a part of his process rather than a public oath. The Luce ramped up pressure in other ways. Lou Sr. began to feed the press with angles suggesting Arthur's dignity had been compromised and that the family's honor demanded an orderly solution. Anonymous sources whispered that Saraphina had a history of ambitious maneuvers, a phrase meant to invoke malice without citing fact. The city's gossip machine loved such distinctions. Rumor thrives in the unprovable. Arthur oscillated between wanting to protect Saraphina and wanting to abdicate his role as the aggrieved husband by receding into a safe agreement. He thought that if he signed a paper now, the headlines would die down. He imagined a neat disappearance from the public stage and a chance to salvage his property, his career, his future. But every option that required him to sacrifice dignity felt impossible. He was a man of habit and fear, and each choice asked him to step into new terrain. One night, Arthur cornered Saraphina in their home. "Sign," he demanded, voice small and thin with panic. "Please." "No," she said. "I will not be shoved out like last season's wardrobe." "You don't get it," he said. "Lou Sr. is ready to—" "I get that you are scared," Saraphina replied. "I get that you want to be safe, but I am not your safety blanket. You want revenge," he accused. "You want to make trouble." She laughed, short, incredulous. "You make it sound as if deciding my life is a favor you can grant or withhold." They argued until Arthur left the room for the sake of the neighbors, or perhaps for the sake of not being seen losing. When the door closed, she reached for a bandage and pressed it to a bruise that no one had seen because most bruises in their lives were emotional and invisible. The city needed sensation, and the people who provided it were eager. A particularly aggressive paparazzo began to follow Saraphina's daily route: her morning walk, the drop-off at a community center, a volunteer session at a women's shelter. He lurked, waiting for the stumble, for the awkward handshake, for the moment that could be retold as scandal. Dominic noticed him from a distance and, instead of making a scene, made a phone call that rerouted that man's focus. There were consequences for persistent harassment when a man in Dominic's world decided they would be enforced. Cease and desist letters, criminal trespass warnings, and, in one case, a brief detention for violating a restraining order. That incident made the tabloids apoplectic. "Billionaire uses force," one headline screamed, and the site had 3 variations within hours. Mrs. Goo smiled in press photographs like a woman who was watching a match of strategy where every gambit was accounted for. "Perhaps," she said to a board of allies, "we must be more subtle." Her subtlety took the shape of money. She arranged a meeting with Lou Sr. under the guise of an olive branch. Her offer was precise, gleaming, enough financial support siphoned into certain charitable arms to offset any damage to the Lou's. The category was vague, anonymized donations that would sit like quiet islands in a sea of scandal. The message was clear: accept the money and accept an arrangement where all parties would save face. "We can give you what you need to move on," Mrs. Goo said, with the posture of an angel offering parried salvation. "A foundation, annual funding, a discreet trust, no fuss, no headlines." Lou Sr. listened, and the wheels in his gaze turned like a man counting grain. "What is your price?" he asked. "Merely silence on your end, and for you to encourage your grandson toward a safer course," Mrs. Goo replied. Dominic heard the negotiation like a glass breaking. He had not been invited to the meeting, yet the offer had the stink of a transaction that sought to buy his mother's intent with someone else's dignity. He thought briefly of taking the offer and making it a mockery, redirecting funds, publicizing the attempt. But such actions would not heal Saraphina. They would only exchange one humiliation for another. Dominic went to Lou Sr. instead. He arrived with the humility of someone bearing a burden, and the hard clarity of someone who had nothing to lose in the face of the old man's threats. "I understand a bargain when I see one," Dominic said without preamble. "You are offering a truce in exchange for a woman. I will not agree to any transaction that demands her erasure." Lou Sr.'s expression tightened into a currency-counting mask. "This is not just about her," he said. "This is our name." "Do you know what your name looks like when it hides the truth?" Dominic asked. "It is a structure propped up by lies. You may preserve it by paper, but not forever. People eventually learn that what is polished has been ground. You could accept help without asking the help to vanish a person." Lou Sr. leaned forward as if to measure Dominic's seriousness. "You think you can lecture me on preservation? You are young to think that grand gestures will buy you legacy." Dominic did not argue legacy. He argued accountability. "I won't be part of a bargain where you pay to remove a human being from her life because it is uncomfortable." The old man's mouth hardened. "You are arrogant." "I am protective," Dominic said, "and I am not your pawn." They were men at opposite ends of a social table, one defending the old order, the other refusing to play the role assigned by that order. Neither won the immediate argument. Both left the room inwardly wound. Mrs. Goo's billion-dollar offer was not given up. It was weaponized in other directions. To a columnist with a taste for high society reveals, to a PR firm that specialized in plausible deniability, to a manufacturer of anonymous leaks. The city is a machine that runs on rumor, and a woman with money could grease its gears with obscene efficiency. One leak, this one engineered to be damning but inconclusive, showed Saraphina at a private gathering where a man, his face obscured by camera blur, had allegedly placed his hand on her waist. The image was cropped to maximize insinuation, and a whisper campaign labeled it evidence. For the internet, innuendo is often compelling enough to be law. Saraphina watched the smear unfold from the window of a small apartment that Arthur had rented after some suggestion that separation might be less costly. She did not react with theatrical outrage. Instead, she sat with a cup of tea and turned the problem into a question of survival. She had navigated slights before. She knew how to turn attention into resource if it could be rerouted. She knew how to pick a fight only where she would win. She also understood that some of the city's forces could not be won by strategy alone. They required a person to refuse the role of pawn. Sometimes that refusal came with costs she could not yet name. The midpoint of their crisis came a week after the hospital incident, on a gray afternoon that felt like a rehearsal for a storm. A video surfaced, short, grainy, but with the kind of clarity that compels conspiracy. Dominic and Saraphina in a dim corridor, a hand on a shoulder, an exchange of words. Context stripped away, the clip made the incident look intimate, or perhaps culpable. Comments flooded in claiming moral failure. Sponsors of Saraphina's small charities pulled tentative support. A conservative columnist penned an op-ed about the arrogance of billionaires who play at salvific romances. A talk show invited two pundits to debate whether Dominic had moral standing. Then, at what should have been the hour of reconciliation between families, the ancestral hall meeting called to settle matters, the real confrontation happened. The ancestral hall smelled of old wood and ink, a place of portraits and the echoes of ceremonies that had long ago codified power. Cameras clustered like stunted birds outside the iron gates. Lou Sr. sat at the head of a heavy table, Mrs. Goo across from him, prim and dangerous as a winter morning. Dominic arrived not with a retinue, but with two lawyers and an air of insistent calm. Saraphina was beside Arthur, who looked like a man about to step into exile. The meeting began as ritual. Lou Sr. cited propriety. Mrs. Goo referenced safeguarding alliances. Serena glanced through the crowd as if cataloging potential victories. Dominic spoke less and measured more. He watched the way Lou Sr.'s face tightened with every mention of reputational harm. He watched Mrs. Goo's eyes scan him with suspicion that wanted to be turned into leverage. For everyone present, Lou Sr. intoned, this is about civility. For everyone present, it is also about profit, Mrs. Goo added, and her voice held that same trained cruelty. You mean about power, Dominic corrected. You mean about choosing the path that secures family assets. And you? Lou Sr. asked. Why drive yourself into scandal? Because the alternative is to allow others to make a spectacle of a married woman to settle their accounts of dignity, Dominic said. The air in the hall shifted. Some in the room had apparently not been advised to expect candor that might make them uncomfortable. She is married, Lou Sr. said. If a man of your position insists on entangling himself with a married woman, of course people will infer seduction. Then they will infer. Does that make the act true? No. Lou Sr.'s jaw flexed, and a cousin at his side chose that moment to lob a crude barb. You will ruin our family, the cousin said. You will sully our name for the sake of not letting the powerful be used as cannons against a woman, Dominic cut in. If my refusal to play their game costs me social favor, then I will pay that price. The hall exploded with murmurs. Lou Sr.'s face flushed. Mrs. Goo's hand tightened around a glass so that the china creaked. What you suggest is extravagant, Mrs. Goo said finally. There are options. We can set up a settlement, a financial proposal, a marriage, a proper, respectable alliance. Dominic, you could do the decent thing. Decent. The word slid across the ancestral wood like a gilded arrow. Dominic considered the history of decency as defined by these rooms. It often involved marriages negotiated for politics and the erasure of inconvenient people. "What you call decent is often just detachment," Dominic said. "You would make a problem go away by letting someone else's life be rearranged into your image of convenience." A silence fell so thick it had weight. Lou Sr. found an argument about appearances easier. He preferred minutia to acknowledge the moral compass Dominic had just wielded. "You speak as though some ideal matters," Lou Sr. said. "Fortune and stability are ideals too." "And when you trample on a woman to preserve a ledger," Dominic replied, "there is no stability, only shame." Saraphina found herself standing then, the room's attention bending toward her like light. "I will not be sold," she said. "I will not be signed away. If you need a resolution, make it without demanding my life as a quiet casualty." Her words were not the woman pleading for mercy. They were the woman of action that the city had not expected. Watching her speak, attendees saw a different kind of strength than the sort traded in their own family histories. The meeting dissolved into spokes of argument that meant little and everything. Lou Sr. retreated into a posture of "we will consult counsel," a perfunctory step that would allow him to create distance and plan. Mrs. Goo vowed quiet fury. Dominic stood, calm but not remiss, and Saraphina felt something like respect settle between them, a respect not based on possession but on her agency. The press smelled victory anyway. Cameras thrummed outside. An unplanned altercation occurred when a man, one of Mrs. Goo's minor enforcers, a man paid more for loyalty than judgment, lunged at a reporter to silence a recorder. The man shoved, and in the shoving a photographer fell and struck his head. For a second, the room held the exact taste of catastrophe. Dominic stepped forward and intercepted the man with an economy of motion that made the room gasp. He did not hit him. He placed his hand on the man's shoulder with a pressure that communicated two things: stop and you have already lost. Security took the man away. The cameras caught the exchange and turned it into noonday drama. Later, the enforcer was charged with assault. Legal consequences unfolded, fast, concrete, beyond family negotiation. For all the Goo's influence, the law had a way of binding even those who thought themselves above cause. Mrs. Goo seethed but could not deny the result. Power, she had learned, could be a blunt instrument and fragile hinge. Afterward, the tabloids tried to turn the ordeal into proof of Dominic's temper. The narrative contorted itself into a dozen shapes. But for a city used to bloodless grandeur, watching him move to stop violence rather than instigate it was a new texture. It muddied the simplistic scripts the papers wanted. That night, Saraphina received invitations that were veiled threats. Lou Sr.'s people offered a composed separation that would spare the family embarrassment. Mrs. Goo made an offer for a funded foundation if Saraphina would agree to a pause from public life. The offers smelled of moral laundering. She considered them silently. One thing she had learned was that offers come with hooks. The foundation would be a gilded cage. The pause would mean a slow erasure. She refused both through a short, sharp response that left some supplicants stunned. "I will not be paused," she wrote in one email. "If you want absolution, do the work. If you want me quiet, you will not get my silence." Dominic read the exchange when she showed it to him. He felt a chill, not of fury, but of calculation. The city's engines were greedy and relentless. Mrs. Goo would not yield simply because a man said something moral. She would escalate and find other avenues: legal entanglements, economic pressure, social maneuvering. He called his board that night and asked to be allowed to abstain from any meetings that required married alliances for him. It was more radical than most imagined. A CEO publicly rejecting the pattern of marriages that consolidated power. They balked, argued about optics, about how his personal choices could affect stock, how one man's scandal could ripple across quarterly promises. Dominic's reply was succinct. He would accept the fallout. Word leaked. Predictably, the market flinched in small ways. Opponents within his own company, people who had always assumed his compliance, began to push suggestions about a reallocation of responsibilities. They whispered about appointing a different public-facing leader. Dominic let them talk. His refusal to partake in a marriage arranged by his family was a small revolution. It also exposed him to a certain vulnerability. The viral video controversy reached its heart when an unknown source posted an extended clip of the alley incident. Instead of inflaming the gossip, the footage was clearer and showed what Dominic had known all along: a woman pulling a disoriented man free from a dangerous path. It hinted at the fear, the quickness of breath, the small heroism that had bound them. The clip shifted the tone for some. For others, it was the start of a new rumor that the lifesaver and the man were colluding to manufacture drama. The city always found a way to mistranslate tenderness into conspiracy. It was here, in the tangle of rumor and reluctant truth, that Dominic decided to make a public statement, not a proclamation of possession, but one of principle. He scheduled a press conference for a neutral location, a small community arts center where Saraphina volunteered. He insisted that the location be about the work she did and not about him. He arrived wearing simple clothes rather than the tailored suit. It was a deliberate choice to avoid creating a visual story the cameras would love to misread. He stood in front of reporters with a calm he had cultivated over many years of decisions. He spoke plainly. "I will make a decision that is mine," he said. "It will not be dictated to me by rumors, by the stock market, or by familial pressure. I will not be a party to arrangements that require the erasure of another person's life. I will not be used to settle accounts of dignity with someone's privacy as collateral." There was a long silence. A few talk show hosts called the speech vainglorious, others called it principled. Saraphina watched from the side and saw not the glitter of dominance, but the fatigue of someone deciding that public cost was worth private fidelity. After the announcement, Serena made a grand appearance at a gala and was photographed leaning close to Dominic to discuss charitable endeavors. Her posture was unmistakable, an attempt to place herself in frames that suggested alliance. Dominic's courtesy toward her was the cool professionalism of a man who refuses to be baited into a private scandal. Publicly, he remained disengaged, his eyes often straying toward Saraphina when she entered rooms. The crescendo came at a city council event meant to honor philanthropic endeavors. The hall was full of elites. Cameras waited. Lou Sr. planned to present a statement that would make the Lou's seem magnanimous. Mrs. Goo planned to slip her own phrases into every sentence like a poison. The city felt like a pressure chamber. At the event's apex, a videographer presented a montage that juxtaposed images of Saraphina volunteering at shelters with grainy clips insinuating impropriety. The montage editor had been sloppy, the cuts were clumsy, but the intent was clear. A section of the crowd tittered. Comments spread online like oil on glass. Dominic rose. He walked to the microphone and did something that stunned the room. He turned the projector off. There was a moment of flummoxed noise, and then his voice took the room like a tide. "What we just saw was not a montage of evidence," he said. "It was a collage of insinuation. We let these feeds decide rich narratives without asking whether the people in them are human. I stand here to say I will not be party to this." Mrs. Goo's smile froze. Many in the hall gasped. Lou Sr.'s face reddened. The cameras whirred to life and recorded his refusal like a verdict. "Mr. Goo, you are overstepping," a council member said. "This is a public event." "Then make it public in truth," Dominic answered. "If you want to discuss these matters, we will do it transparently and with evidence. We will not trade in whispers." The room's response was mixed, admiration from a small contingent and thin-necked anger from others. In the end, the projectionist was fired, the montage condemned by some and defended by others. The incident became yet another headline: CEO interrupts gala, philanthropy versus privacy. There were consequences. Mrs. Goo called him afterwards with a voice that tasted of sulfur and strategy. "You caused a scene," she said. "You embarrassed us." "I caused a scene because someone treated a human like collateral," Dominic replied. "You put us at risk," she said. "Investors will ask questions. Alliances will wobble. People will wonder if you can be rational." "There will be questions," he conceded, "and I will answer them. I am not a man who avoids consequence, but I will not be the instrument used to erase another person's life." Her silence held a threat. Not every threat needed to be spoken aloud. She had more weapons than he imagined disclosing: financial condescension, strategic repositioning, quiet pressure on board members. She could make his public life, his career, his company's stock feel precarious. Dominic felt the weight of her displeasure as a chill that stepped into the bones. Saraphina, for her part, had to decide whether she wanted the protection he offered. She respected him, but had often steered clear of the invitation to be a protected woman. At one point in the quiet that followed the gala, she told him plainly, "If we do this, if you insist on being involved, I will be counted as yours whether I like it or not." Dominic heard the warning and the plea. "I am not trying to own you," he said. "I am trying to ensure you are not dissolved by gossip." "That sounds like the same thing from a different angle," she said. "There is a danger in being sheltered. It's not always safer." He considered that danger. He had a lifetime of being told that his shelter was necessary. He had a lifetime of watching how shelter could become a prison. He wanted to be careful. One evening, after a board meeting where his family's influence had created a small rebellion against his public stance, Mrs. Goo made her final attempt at leverage. She offered him what she thought would be an impossible bargain. She proposed a marriage, an alliance through Saraphina Jang, that would put him in a position to broker a peace that required Saraphina's removal from the public eye. The money involved was obscene and offered like a bandage for a wound she did not want to treat. "You can marry well," she said. "You will gain a partner who understands the currency of our circle. Accept this, and you will be able to end the scandal your way. It will be neat." Dominic stared at her portrait in the screen like a man reading a contract. "And you think my choice is between profit and grace?" "I think the world is practical," she said. "Do not romanticize practicality." He hung up without the theatricality she expected. For Dominic, the choice was deeper. He could accept a marriage that would be a transaction, else be forced to endure her manipulations. He chose neither. He would not marry Saraphina to placate his mother. Neither would he hand Saraphina her privacy for a price. If people wanted to condemn him for stubbornness, so be it. The fallout came in ways both expected and surprising. Certain board members questioned his judgment. Some investors pried. Mrs. Goo began to pull back on favor in small ways, canceling a donation here, an introduction there. The city's gossip still hummed, but now it included a new strain: a CEO who rejected all other women for a married woman. What had been a sinister rumor mutated into a peculiar mythology. He was, suddenly, a type, reckless or romantic depending on who told the story. There were darker attempts, too. An anonymous envelope arrived at Saraphina's charity office, a copy of her father's past debts, a rough dossier compiling moments meant to embarrass. Someone had hired investigators to dig up old family secrets. Saraphina burned the dossier in a sink and watched the pages curl black. The act of destroying the filth had a ritualistic clarity to it. It was defiant, not performative. As things escalated, an investigator tracked a link in the montage to a man who had once done favor work for Mrs. Goo, someone who pushed narratives in exchange for contracts. The discovery led them closer to the truth of who had orchestrated the smear. Dominic's legal team quietly compiled a file. They made the option to press charges feel real. For the first time, the pushback had teeth, a plausible legal path to hold the smear makers accountable. When evidence came together, the man behind parts of the campaign, an intermediary, was arrested for conspiracy to defame for profit. The arrest did not end the gossip, but it did establish that the city could interpret rumor as a business plan, and that such a plan could have legal consequences. The small victory did not fix everything. It did not unring the bells of suspicion, but it gave Saraphina and Dominic a foothold. They used that foothold in practical ways. They convened a meeting at a private legal office. Saraphina, Arthur, Dominic, and their lawyers were present. The legal counsel explained the reflection period, the procedural hiatus that would complicate any divorce filing. It would not prevent a divorce forever, but it would make the logistics less immediate and more public. Lou Sr. had used procedural law to his advantage many times. Now, law could be a shield rather than a sword. Signing to end a marriage is not a single instant, the lawyer said. There are windows, there are rights, there are processes designed to ensure the parties are counseled. It is not efficient to be cruel in the name of efficiency. We will use that. Saraphina sat quietly through the explanation. For her, the law was not a moral arbiter. It was a tool. She would wield it as a tool if it meant not being destroyed by rumor. But she refused to be erased by process. She insisted that any steps taken would be hers to choose.
"Then let's do it," she said finally. "Let's agree on rules. Let's make them transparent. If that requires mediation or reflection periods, then fine. But I will not be signed away without my consent." The decision to move forward with a mediated path forced the Lous to adapt. Lou Sr., who preferred decisive orders, discovered an unfamiliar terrain, bargaining that legally required compromise. The family met in small rooms to decide whether their reputation was worth the fight. Ultimately, they accepted mediation because a protracted legal battle would expose them to far more risk than a carefully managed private solution. As the mediation proceeded, Dominic found himself in a new kind of theater. He followed Saraphina not as a suitor, but as an ally. He attended sessions where legal professionals spoke in terms he had known since business school: stakes, liability, reputation management. He sat quietly, listening to people argue about schedules and fees. When it was his turn, he spoke on Saraphina's behalf as if he were an ordinary man who had seen injustice and could not pretend otherwise. "I will not bankroll her quiet," he said, "but I will stand against manufactured harm. If your aim is to preserve a name by making someone's life disappear, I will oppose it." The mediator looked at him as if to weigh his seriousness. "Mr. Goo," she said, "this is not about you wanting to rescue. It is about ensuring both parties are treated fairly." "Then treat her fairly," he replied. "Do not demand her erasure for your comfort." Saraphina watched him and saw, perhaps for the first time, the contour of a man willing to take the cost of dissent for something he could not fully explain. She also saw the way that cost bled into his professional life. She hated that his stand could be read as romance instead of principle. She hated that his family thought of him as incapable of rationality because of one private debt he kept like a secret. But she also knew she had allies in a man who understood what was owed to him and to others. The mediation concluded not with a dramatic signing, but with a pact. They would proceed with transparency, the reflection period would be respected, and both families would publicly agree to refrain from making any statements that would be defamatory. It was a compromise orchestrated to put limits on cruelty. It did not, and could not, erase the scent of scandal. It simply made the mechanisms that fed gossip harder to exploit. A week later, a new kind of scandal broke, not manufactured this time, but a revelation that shifted sympathy rather than scandal. A gifted investigative journalist had traced part of the smear to a consulting company with ties to both families. The reporter published not only the connections, but an interview with the intermediary who had been arrested.
He talked about being paid to shape narratives, about being given directives to feed media, and about pressure that had come down from an unnamed matriarch. Mrs. Goo called her lawyers. Her defenders argued the piece was defamatory. But the story had landed. It had cracked the glossy surface to reveal a network of paid rumor. For a moment, the city paused. The narrative stuttered. People do not like to be shown the machinery behind their entertainments. In that pause, Dominic took a step that surprised both the press and his own family. He went to a small public forum and spoke not as an owner of industry, but as a man who had been saved and felt a responsibility to protect a voice. Saraphina did not ask to be thrust into the center of something that was not hers, he said. She saved me once. That is an event I cannot forget. But I stand here not because of debt alone. I stand here because I believe that we should not weaponize power against the vulnerable. If the price of that belief is that I am read as romantic or reckless, then so be it. I would rather be accused of feeling than complicit in erasure. The speech was taken in many ways. Some called him heroic, others called him self-indulgent. He did not care which they chose. He had made a choice and was willing to live with the consequences. Saraphina watched him from a distance and felt a heat of gratitude that was complicated by the fear of being labeled as static in someone else's story. She did not want to be a plot device. She wanted to be a person, messy, political, strategic. Dominic's actions had to be reconciled with that need. At home that evening, after a day of media frenzy and legal maneuvers, Dominic prepared a simple meal, an act that was almost criminal in its domesticity for a man of his world. He made tea and warmed bread. When she came to his apartment, the city below them was a quilt of light and rumor. They ate in silence for a few moments, letting the ordinary comfort of food be its own kind of protection. It was an act of tenderness that was not shown for cameras or to make a point. It was private and human. Later, in the quiet, Saraphina spoke about the moment she had pulled him from that alley. Her voice drifted into the room like smoke. She described the pulse of a city that moved too quickly, and the strange human reflex that made her reach out. "There are moments when you choose to act," she said. "You don't always think of consequences. You think of the person in front of you." "And then?" he asked. "And then you watch how the city tells the story," she said. "Sometimes the story is kind. Sometimes it eats you." He reached out and took her hand, not possessive, but connected. "I will not let them eat you." "You keep saying that," she said softly, "and I appreciate it, but I am not hungry for a protector." "I know," he replied. "I know you hate being seen as a prize." She smiled then, the smile of a woman who had been figured out more than once, who refused being boxed. "I do, but I also don't want to be lonely in a fight." "Then don't be lonely," he said. "If you want aid, accept it. If you want withdrawal, demand it. I will obey the line you set." She tested him with a look. "If I ask you to step back, will you?" "If you ask me to step back, I will," he said, "but I will never pretend not to care." The answer satisfied her partly and unsettled her partly. It was a truce built from mutual respect rather than dominion. That night, after they had spoken and eaten and navigated the fragile geography of their terms, Dominic did something quiet and symbolic. He took out his phone and stared at the contact list where her name was still not unblocked. He thought of how the blacklist had been a small cruelty, a way to manage chaos. He thought of how the most eloquent gestures were the ones no one would see. He tapped the screen and unblocked her number. It was a gesture with no ceremony, no press release, no fanfare. For him, it was more meaningful than any public proclamation. It was a private acknowledgement that she could reach him unfiltered. It did not imply ownership. It implied availability, in a world where availability was rare. When she received the unblocked message in the morning, the small ping that made her eyebrows lift, she did not write back immediately.
The gesture mattered because it had been offered without strings. Days later, the city's noise had not calmed entirely, but the legal measures had introduced a slow, grinding accountability. The smear-making network began to unravel as more intermediaries were named. Mrs. Goo continued her maneuvers, but now they were public and more difficult to mask. Lou Sr., who had performed dignity flawlessly for decades, watched as the system he had relied upon showed signs of corrosion. At the end of the week, a public hearing convened. Not a trial, but a panel where media ethics and legal consequences for coordinated defamation were discussed. Dominic testified as a witness to the harm caused by manufactured rumor. Saraphina sat in the audience with Arthur, who had matured through humiliation into a quieter version of himself. He had apologized to Saraphina in private for his impatience and cowardice. She had accepted with the guarded civility of a woman who wanted a future but knew it could only be built on truth. In the hearing, someone from Mrs. Goo's circle spoke on her behalf. It was expected. She spoke of misinterpretation, of the speed of online culture, of the wrongness of rushes to judgment. She did not apologize in the way most wanted. She offered a lawyer's statement of contrition. After the hearing, cameras followed Dominic and Saraphina as they left the building. Outside, a cluster of photographers shouted questions, hungry for a line that would make sensation. Dominic turned to Saraphina, saw the tiredness beneath her shoulders, and chose a private phrase that might have been a vow. "You are not alone," he said. She let the words land. "Nor are you," she answered. The relationship that formed between them was not a simple romance, nor an obvious scandal. It was a complicated alliance between two people who shared a strange debt. One had been saved, the other had been bound to protect. They both knew that what the city would call dangerous was not merely the possibility of a love affair, but the rupture of expected scripts. He had rejected the suitors and alliances that would have made his life easier. He had refused to be offered as a solution to a family's embarrassment. She had refused to be paupered into quiet. The final public act happened not with a grand marriage or a dramatic gesture, but with a simple, unambiguous choice Dominic made to his own circle. At a shareholders' meeting, certain board members, those who had whispered that his private life would hurt the company, brought up the idea of his distraction as a business risk. They suggested he step back from the public role and appoint a deputy. Dominic listened. He had considered the price he might pay. He stood and addressed the room with the same directness he had used before. "I will not be intimidated into trading my moral compass for perceived stability," he said. "If my personal choices make me less palatable to some investors, then so be it. I will accept whatever consequences these decisions bring. I refuse to participate in a culture that demands the erasure of humans for reputational clarity." There were murmurs, some applause, and the thin sound of resignation in some corners. His refusal was a seismic shift for men and women who had long placed personal life into neat boxes. When the meeting ended, he went to Saraphina. He did not make a public offer of marriage. The point had never been to convert gratitude into an ownership claim. Instead, he placed both hands on her shoulders and looked at her with a seriousness that stripped away any possibility of the act becoming a headline. "I will reject them," he said. "I will reject everyone who would use me to make your life disappear. Whether or not you want me near you in the quiet of your days, I will not be a tool to erase you." There was no flourish, no dramatic civil defiance meant to be endlessly quoted. It was a clear statement of intent that matched the title the city would give them: the CEO who rejects everyone for a married woman. There was danger in that label. Danger in public perception, in family reprisal, in the political consequences. But for Dominic, the danger was simply the price of refusing to let power be used to wound. Saraphina's answer was not a capitulation. It was an acceptance of what was offered, but under conditions she named.
"You will not control me," she said. "You will not decide my days."
"If you stand with me, stand because I asked you to stand, not because you own me." He nodded. Agreed. They walked out side by side into a city that would continue to gossip and speculate. Cameras flashed, voices called. The future remained uncertain. The Loos and the Goos would continue to maneuver, and the press would continue to circumscribe their lives with rumor. Consequences would unfold. Boardroom tension for Dominic, social retribution from Mrs. Goo, legal contests from those who had been implicated in smear campaigns. But the pivot had been set. That night, Dominic drove Saraphina to a small, quiet hospital room not because she was injured, but because the day's events had exhausted her. It was an almost domestic aftercare that meant more than luxury or spectacle. He sat with her, fetched tea, warmed blankets. He bandaged an old scrape on her wrist, the way someone who had watched another person's injuries would know to do, gentle, attentive, careful. She watched him with an expression that carried relief and an unspoken sadness for what each must endure. "Promise me one thing," she said softly. "What is that?" "Don't make me a statue of someone you redeemed," she said. "Let your defense be about justice, not your story." He nodded. "I promise. I will defend the truth, not the narrative." They sat in that room with low lamps and the distant hum of the city. Beyond the window, flashes of cameras blinked like a bad, bright punctuation. Inside, a man and a woman had made a pact, neither to own nor be owned. They had declared a dangerous truce, to stand with each other under fire without trading autonomy for protection. It was an odd, fragile thing, equal parts tender and risky. At the doorway, Dominic paused, his hand on the knob. He could feel the pressure of his mother's disapproval like a shadow. He could sense Lou Sr. smoldering. He could anticipate the drip of headlines that would attempt to paint their choices as folly. But for a man who had been saved once in an alley, the arithmetic of what mattered had changed. He turned back and, in a voice that was private, said, "I will reject everyone else." She laughed softly, the sound of a woman who had been offering barbs to the world and found now she had an ally. "Don't make it a spectacle," she whispered. He smiled. "Not a spectacle," he said. "A choice." They held a silence that was not empty, but full of things unfurling, consequences, tenderness, strategy, and the slow, risky work of living in the public eye without being consumed by it. Outside, photographers clicked. Inside, a lamp hummed. His phone lay face down on the bedside table, but he had unblocked her. The small, private gesture had been made in the moment where privacy could still be chosen. The city would call them a dangerous pair, a scandal in slow bloom. In private, however, the danger was simple. They had refused to let themselves be shaped only by others' expectations. For Dominic, rejecting everyone else was less a romantic platitude than a deliberate refusal to be weaponized. For Saraphina, accepting his protection on her own terms was a reclamation of agency. When the cameras finally paused and the night settled into a quieter rhythm, Dominic turned off his phone. He held Saraphina's hand in the dark, as if proven to himself that some choices require no broadcast. The future was uncertain. Boardroom tremors, family ruptures, and legal skirmishes would come. But in the sober light of the hospital room, a man who had been saved and a woman who had saved him sat in a small, shared peace. Outside, the city continued to write its scripts. Inside, the two of them practiced living outside the story the press wanted to tell. The choice had been made, loud in some places, private in others, and it would shape what unfolded next. If this chapter left you on edge, share your thoughts below and subscribe to follow where their dangerous affair leads next.